Good morning. Thanks for finding this video. I'm going to get to the sermon proper in just a minute here, but I wanted to just kind of explain really briefly what this is about, why I'm doing this. See, I'm not really a preacher as such, but at this point in time, the church that I attend does not have a pastor. We did have one. He was a man from India, but personal matters required that he go back to India. And so, with global circumstances just being what they are, we have not yet found another pastor. And so I have been preaching for our church about once a month, just to help share the burden of the Sunday morning sermon and, help out those who are responsible for keeping that preaching schedule going. And so that started about a year and a half ago that I did my very first sermon in church. And I wanted to redo it now just in order to really be able to share it better with anybody who might want to hear it. And so, at that point in time, we were working on a series through the book of Ephesians, and I ended up with a part in the middle of chapter 5. And so I'd like to share that sermon again with you now. So, just to kind of recap a little bit leading up to the passage today. If you go back to kind of the start of chapter 4, Paul begins there by talking about the need for patience with each other and the importance of unity in the Spirit. And then Paul gets into discussing certain spiritual gifts and the need for sound doctrine so that the body can grow strong together. Now, somewhere in the middle of the book of Ephesians as a whole, Paul kind of changes topics a little bit. Because at the beginning, he was largely discussing theological matters. But then he switches to sort of the practical application of all that theology. And so that trend continues right through the beginning of chapter 6. And so the passage that we're looking at today is right in the middle of that kind of that practical part. And so please turn to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 to 14. I'm going to be reading just from the NIV. I know it's maybe not as popular as it once was, but it is the translation that I grew up with and that I'm familiar with. And so, that's the one I'll just be preaching from today. So, Ephesians chapter 5, starting with verse 8, says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible. This is why it is said, 'Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" Now, just for the sake of being consistent with the text, I want to just briefly mention verse 7 as well here. I know a lot of Bibles have a nice paragraph division between verses 7 and 8, but in reality, verse 7 functions as a segue between these two sections of the passage. And so, having just finished several verses on sexual immorality and greed, and describing the people who embrace that kind of a lifestyle and the consequences awaiting them, Paul then says in verse 7, "Therefore, do not be partners with them." Now, the Greek word behind partners, in a very slightly different form, often meant something like business partners. Okay, now that said, the only other use of the specific form of this word is in Ephesians 3:6, which says, "Sharers together in the promise in Christ Jesus." And so Paul is saying that the connection that we have with Christ, that bond, that sharing, can only be with Christ. It's impossible to have that kind of connection with the Son of God and at the same time with those who oppose him. Okay, so I'll elaborate a bit more on that when we get into verse 11. So having discussed the idea that we cannot be partnered with sinners, well then the implied question is, what do we do instead? And that's the question that Paul starts to answer in our passage this morning. So starting in verse 8, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light." If you had to pick just one verse to summarize Paul's writing, not just Ephesians, but throughout the New Testament, then I would suggest this one as a pretty strong choice, because it certainly summarizes this epistle. As a primer on Christian living, Ephesians readily boils down to this idea. We used to be sinners condemned to die, and now we are heirs with Christ. And what a joy that is, that we have, all that blessing from Christ. Now, as simple as this verse is, it's also just staggering. See, light and dark are regular themes in Scripture, especially in John's writing. But nowhere else is there such a direct statement as this. See, most other passages comparing Christians to light, hardly feel related by comparison. We understand that we are the light of the world, and Christ is the light of the world, and God is light, but there's nothing else that's just as blatant in depicting what our conversion means as this verse. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. There's two things here that I want to point out. One, notice that Paul says they were once darkness, not surrounded by darkness or living in darkness, but they were filled with darkness. But now the opposite is true. They are filled with light, or simply are light. Okay? This is not a change of circumstances or surroundings, but a change of substance. We have changed from being dark to being light. And second, where does that change come from? Well, from God. We are light in the Lord. Now make no mistake here, okay? Yes, we are now light, but we are only light because of God. There is nothing that we have done or can do to make that change. It's only by choosing to serve God that He effects that change in us. This is the reason for the warning that Paul gives in verse 7. We are sharers with Christ, and so we are light. If we have shunned God and chosen to be sharers or partners with sin, then we can never become the light that God promises us. We cannot be partners with sin and God at the same time. Now, the end of verse 8 there, live as children of light. Okay, that's basic enough, right? What we are will dictate how we live. We are light, therefore we need to exemplify that in our lives. But what does that entail? Verse 9 says, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Some translations actually say fruit of the Spirit instead of fruit of the light, although most of the stuff I read indicated that light is probably the better word choice there. But still, there's a common idea in both places, especially with the use of goodness in both lists here. So what is goodness? Well, there's only 4 places in the New Testament where this specific word is used, and 3 of them have a similar context. The last one, though, is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 11, which says, with this in mind, we constantly pray for you that our God may count you worthy of His calling, and that by His power He may fulfill every good purpose of yours and every act prompted by your faith. So here we have good purpose, okay, is how they translated the Greek word. Now there seems to be 2 aspects of goodness here, attitude and action. So our attitude should be such that we want to do good in the same way that God is good. And this shows in our actions. Now, good doesn't necessarily mean being nice. Okay, one example which I found in Vine's expository dictionary was Jesus clearing the temple. I mean, he was angry, he was flipping over tables, he was using a whip to clear the cattle. He was not being nice, but what he did was good. His desire was good because he wanted to rid the temple of that which was defiling it. And his actions were good because he did clear the temple. See, good actions are usually done for the benefit of someone else, even if they don't see what that benefit is. Okay, one example that comes to mind, and I'm sure we can all relate to it, whether being on the giving or the receiving end, is when you discipline a child. Okay, so as a parent, I understand that the point of proper discipline is to help my child grow up as they should. It's for their benefit. Now, I'm not convinced that my children always see it that way, but I trust that in time they will understand that despite my mistakes, my intentions and desires were good. Okay, righteousness. Romans 5:7 says, very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. And so this shows a qualitative difference between goodness and righteousness. Okay, back to Vine's New Testament dictionary again. Righteousness is an attribute of God exhibited in the death of Christ, which is sufficient to show men that God is neither indifferent to sin nor regards it lightly. On the contrary, it demonstrates that quality of holiness in him which must find expression in his condemnation of sin. So if you've ever heard the saying that God hates sin but loves the sinner, well, it's his righteousness that is the reason that God hates sin. See, because God is holy and perfect, the very existence of sin is an affront to the very essence of who he is. Very closely related to this is God's justice. God is a just God, and so sin must be punished. So we can understand that since sin is a problem, both his righteousness and justice intend to deal with that problem. Now, another aspect of righteousness is the idea of right living. If you look a little bit further ahead in Ephesians 6, we're told to put on the breastplate of righteousness. And then Romans 6 instructs us to do not offer the parts of your body to sin as instruments of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as instruments of righteousness. And then that same chapter goes on to talk about being slaves to righteousness, because it brings us towards holiness. So it's through Christ that we become righteous. And so we are called to lives that show goodness and righteousness. And I think there's a connection between those two as well, because I believe that both aspects of righteousness, the hating sin and right living, can both be motivation for goodness. See, by living a life that mirrors Christ, we are prompted not only to stop sinning, but to replace sinful acts with good deeds. And as our righteousness increases, so does our goodness. Right? This is the process of sanctification. All right, so on to the third fruit here, truth. Now, to be honest, this one's a little bit harder to nail down anything as specific. It's a very common word throughout the New Testament. And that's great. That's very helpful for determining the general meaning, but it's less helpful in trying to find specific similar usage of the word, just because it's found, all over the place. So just, for now, to give you something to chew on, Paul does also mention truth in chapter 4. And in fact, this list, the goodness, righteousness, and truth, is partially a reference back to chapter 4, verses 20 and 21, which says, "You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus." So whatever else Paul may have had in mind, the truth that we need to shine comes from Christ. I mean, Jesus said very clearly, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And as we follow him and grow in our knowledge and understanding of him, truth, along with goodness and righteousness, will become more evident in our lives. Now, within the greater context of Ephesians, I would also suggest that here, truth refers to our doctrine. Just gleaning from several other sources, biblical and extra-biblical, we can learn that the Ephesians were pretty good with doctrine. And, I mean, as well they should have been. Paul spent 3 years there. Timothy was sent there by Paul. And it's very likely that the Apostle John lived there as well before he was exiled. Fun fact, the Isle of Patmos, where John was exiled, is just offshore and then just a little ways down the coast from Ephesus. And so reading in, Revelation chapter 2 and the letter to the Ephesians there, we know that they held to correct doctrine pretty strongly, as should we. I mean, Jesus is the truth, and so what we believe about him and what we teach about him are extremely important, because that is the basis of all of our doctrine. And so again, as our understanding of Jesus grows, so too will the truthfulness of our doctrine. All right, let's move on here to verse 10. Now, if you read the sentence that starts in verse 8 without the parenthetical inclusion of verse 9, here's what Paul says. "Live as children of light and find out what pleases the Lord." So we're to find out what pleases the Lord, our Lord, right? Now, that is a whole sermon series in and of itself. So, how do you address that in 3 minutes? Well, for starters, when Paul says, find out what pleases the Lord, the Greek word used there is dokimazo, or something like that. But it means to test or to prove. And in fact, it's the same word that Paul uses in Romans 12, verse 2. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so the idea is about discernment, about knowing that what we are doing is pleasing to God. Paul uses the same word again in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test everything, hold on to the good. So what kind of things are good? What pleases the Lord? All right, we already talked about goodness, so we don't need to go over that again. But, frankly, there are a host of answers as to what pleases God. So for today, I'll just give you one to take home and think about. But I would say joyful obedience. I say that because obeying God's commands pleases him. Those of you who have children will know how nice it is when your kids obey you the first time you ask something. I know that I myself start to get a little unhappy after 4 or 5 times of the same request. And so, when my kids cheerfully obey me the first time, it's like, wow, that's amazing. As I was thinking about this further, I was reminded of 1 John chapter 2, verse 3, which says, we know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. And then chapter 5, verses 2 and 3 of 1 John says, this is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. This is love for God, to obey his commands, and his commands are not burdensome. And then in 2 John verse 6, and this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. Now I realize that John mentions obedience as a result of love, and love is not specifically mentioned in our passage. However, for one, it's perfectly natural for us to want to please those that we love, and 2, love is also a significant theme throughout Ephesians, even if it's not mentioned in this specific passage this morning. So jumping to verse 11 now. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. So this verse expands a bit on what Paul said in verse 7, therefore do not be partners with them. So speaking about sexually immoral and greedy people specifically there, although he also mentions those who are disobedient. Now if we are partners with Christ, we cannot at the same time be partners or sharers with these sinners, right? So how do we interact with other people? Now some people have taken this or understood this to mean total separation. And so you have, various attempts over the centuries who have been made by different religious orders to totally separate, by building a monastery in the middle of nowhere or something like that. Now, to me, that's taking Paul's statement somewhat further than he intended. I mean, after all, verse 11 tells us to expose the deeds of darkness, and for that you actually have to be around said deeds. You can't expose something if you aren't around it. And so that complete separation is nonsensical and I would say non-biblical. Now, Klein Snodgrass is a New Testament scholar, and he's author of the Ephesians commentary in the NIV Application Commentary series, a book I referenced frequently for the sermon, in fact. And so I just want to read you a little section of what he had to say about verse 11 here. He says, the separation Paul calls for, however, is not so much a withdrawal as a confrontation. Expose often carries a nuance of correcting or convincing someone. Whether the confrontation is only by conduct or also verbal is debated, though to suggest this passage has nothing to do with spoken confrontation is overly narrow. Although no guidelines are given for confronting, clearly Paul is not thinking of geographical separation and avoidance of contact, but of refusal to participate in indecent actions. After all, contact with non-Christians is required if the light is to accomplish its purpose. So as I read this verse and I thought about the implications, I was just reminded of the phrase, be in the world, but not of it. And I think that really sums up Paul's point here. As children of light, living in a world of darkness, we should not be joining in with those dark deeds. But rather, like a candle in a dark room, we should be exposing them for what they are. fruitless acts, which are shameful to even mention, which is what verse 12 tells us. By contrast, the fruit of the light, by contrast to the fruit of the light, the deeds of darkness are essentially dead. They have no fruit. They do not bring any benefit to anyone. So verses 13 and 14 then elaborate on this thought a little bit further, I think. It says, "But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible." Now it seems that the Greek behind these verses is rather unusual, and that makes it hard to translate. So this is kind of my best understanding and kind of a general consensus that I got from reading several different authors. And in that too, I also noticed that the NIV has a different verse division from other translations, and even the NIV itself changed significantly between the 1984 and the 2011 versions. And so that all just kind of adds to the confusion of exactly what, these two verses are saying. So I think the point behind this verse goes back to the Great Commission. See, Pauline theology often includes the idea of a circle of influence. Okay, so Paul warns us away from associating with the wicked too closely because he doesn't want believers drawn into those deeds of darkness. By the same concept, though, he wants us to influence others. And so just as Christ called us to make disciples, I believe Paul is calling us to use our light to make other lights. Okay, so the logic goes kind of like this. We are light, and we use our light to expose the darkness. The people who are in darkness are drawn to the light, and then become new lights themselves, and that cycle continues. Interact Ministries, the organization that I work for, has a slogan about teaching people to be disciple-making disciples. And I think that kind of illustrates the point here. It sounds a little funny just because Paul is running with his light analogy to do that, but I think that's the point he's trying to get across. Now the last quotation doesn't have any obvious sources. It could be from a hymn from the time maybe, or some other kind of common writing. There's a chance it's drawing on ideas of light and resurrection from Isaiah 26:19 and 60 verse 1, but that's not certain either. None of that, though, takes away from the impact that it has here. Because this little section seems to be mixing three different metaphors. Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. 1 Thessalonians 5:5-6 says, "You are all children of light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be alert and self-controlled." Then earlier in Ephesians, at the start of chapter 2, Paul tells us, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." And then the whole Christ shining on you is coming back to the light analogy. And so this is essentially a description of our salvation tying back into verse 13. So we awake, we rise from the deadness of our sin, and Christ will shine on us, making us light like him. So where does that leave us? Paul makes it plain that people of light are characterized by their actions of light, and people of darkness by their deeds of darkness. That is, we show what we are made of by what we do. So that means we have to live different lives from people around us. Now, how do we recognize those other people? Okay, now this can kind of be a touchy question. Because far too many people have made the mistake of judging others simply because of what they see. The difficulty is that all we really have is what we see. Okay? Now, I'm not saying we should be judging people. Okay, God knows our hearts, and that's up to him. Thank goodness. But I think this is why Paul has an emphasis on have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, as opposed to, something like have nothing to do with people of darkness. Paul is not calling for us to judge people, but to observe their actions and determine whether those actions please the Lord. And that shouldn't be too hard, because we should already be discerning our own actions and whether they please God. And so if it turns out that somebody's actions do not please God, then do not associate with those actions in any way, but instead expose them, for the benefit of the person who is doing them. See, the whole point of this is to bring them into the light so that they may begin their own relationship with God, right? That goes back to the goodness we talked about earlier. In 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 to 11, Paul clarifies something that he had written previously to the Corinthian church. They thought he had told them to stay away from sexually immoral people of this world, is kind of how the phrasing goes. Now, Paul replies that this wouldn't work because you would have to leave this world. But what he meant was people who claim to be Christians but live immorally. And I think that's helpful in understanding our passage here today too. See, if we look at an action and see that it does not please God, then our response is the same. It doesn't matter if the person committing the act is a Christian or not, or claims to be a Christian and doesn't show it. God knows their hearts, and He's the one who judges them, but He wants us to expose sin. After all, we are called to righteousness. As we wrap this up here, I want to make one last practical point. I find that all too often our focus, or at least my focus, is on not sinning, okay, avoiding sin. Now the problem with that is that I am still concerned with sin. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, okay, it's good to be concerned about sin. But if that's what I'm focusing on, then that's most likely where I will go. See, I remember learning back in driver's ed class many moons ago how important it is to keep our eyes on the road. And the reason for that is that we tend to steer the car toward the thing that we're looking at. That's just something that our body does naturally. Our eyes lead us, right? I learned, a very similar lesson when I did track and field in elementary school, even more moons ago. See, when you're in a straight line sprint, you pick a point in front of you and you run towards it. The same thing came up when I was learning navigation when I was doing flight training. You pick a point in the distance and you fly towards it. See, the author of Hebrews says in chapter 12, "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith." When we take our eyes off of Jesus, that's when we have problems. So even if our intent is to avoid the thing that we're looking at, we're still looking at the wrong thing. It's only by focusing on Jesus and going towards Him that we stay away from the sin that we wanted to avoid in the first place. And so, as is so often the case with questions for Christian living, the answer just comes right down to Jesus. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope this is helpful to you in some way. Leave a comment if there's a question or something that was helpful for you. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a good day.